Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Today we're going to be exploring Mobile Bay, the old world port city of Mobile, Alabama. And as we fly over the current capital of Alabama, we're reminded of the fact that this is the state in the deep south that has many different assertions and impressions about what the people in the land are really like. When you actually get into Mobile, though, you'll notice that there are some very interesting similarities to our earlier exploration of New Orleans, or Norlands. And what we see here is that this is also a city that was founded by the French off of the Gulf of Mexico. That later became a very substantial port. And indeed, it is still remembered for its port facilities, and it played a very prominent role during the United States Civil War and subsequently during World War II. So we can see that the entire area of Mobile Bay, just off the Gulf of Mexico, is the only major port for Alabama. Really, when you look at the geography of Alabama, you'll see that this is marked as the tail of Alabama and the great port city of Mobile. Now, what we're told officially by history is that Mobile was founded by the French in 1702, so quite similar to New Orleans, although founded a little bit earlier. And once again, we see that the standard plan we have, our little star fort, because you can't have a settlement without a star fort, and yet we have areas of land that already seem to be designated. Indeed, shortly after that, it seems as though they quickly settled Mobile in Alabama, or what would become Alabama, and they already had a good idea of how they wanted to lay it out, and where they wanted the city to be, and how they wanted the buildings to be built. It was all from the master plan of this Frenchman, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bastille, or however you say it in French. Where are you, Christopher Lambert? Go ahead and give me a laugh. Thank you very much. Anyways, it's always interesting that they have pictures of these individuals in their armor when they're being drawn. You can also find the painting that shows the same thing. Apparently, this particular French individual was an architectural genius, as they all seem to be, and he decided to lay out a very impressive star fort. Now, one interesting example for the city of Mobile, Alabama, is that we can actually see how star forts performed during the Civil War. And we can see that this particular star fort had a couple different designs to it. Now, this is known as the Fort Condé, or it was also known as Fort Charlotte, once the British took over the area. Yes, another one of these stories much like New Orleans and St. Augustine, where the city or the port changed hands many times. And we can see in this little model that this does conform to the traditional design that we think of as a star fort. And of course we have the little strange turret, or almost looking like it's a little house that someone decided to put on the point right there. What exactly is the purpose of that, and why would you want to be in that? You'd think that'd be the first thing targeted by the mighty cannons that they possessed at the time. Well, they rebuilt it today for current tourism, and the star fort, or I'm sorry, the fort that they still have in Mobile, and you can see that in no way does it match the previous construction, but of course it's just a mock-up and it's just for tourist purposes, so we can't really conclude anything from it. We recall that we saw another fort, Condé, in Portugal, and it was very impressive and still very intact star fort, although they also tell us that this particular star fort had to have a lot of renovations done on it. Renovations where, I asked? Did they replant the grass? I doubt it. When we look at Fort Condé, we can see that it has been renovated a little bit, but I would like to explore this particular location in person because I think this might offer a very good example of the contrast between building materials, and it's something that I prefer to ascertain and assess in person. We have it in the Revolutionary War that at Mobile we're told that the British acquired Mobile from the French, winning the 7 Years' War. The Spanish decided to attack them as France's ally during the American Revolutionary War, and they seized Mobile. They being the Spanish in 1780. That was until known Spanish agent and senior U.S. Army officer James Wilkinson, we'll call him Wilkie, seized the city, Mobile, from Spain in 1813 as part of the War of 1812. Say all that quickly. And after that, then in 1815, it became an American city. And indeed, it seems as though the Spanish knew that the United States were going to seize everything, including Alabama and Florida. And indeed, under Andrew Jackson, they did just that. Interesting look, though, here at the layout that the United States had for Mobile, and we can see that by 1838, only a few short years later, that the city was rapidly growing. And indeed, the plan seemed to have expanded. Or did they just simply make more of the plan available? Interesting symbolism that we see on this particular map. The other intriguing aspect is when you look closer at some of the buildings they already had designated. Imagine being able to construct buildings like this in 1838. And obviously they were constructed before that. Very impressive buildings available for the time, and intriguing how they look so much alike, with the hotel, and the school. And we'll take a closer look, and here at these buildings we see very impressive construction for the time frame. It should be noted that within the 100 period from 1800 to 1900, the population of Mobile went from 1,500 to about 38,000, or a growth of 2,500%. So about 2.5 times what the growth of the United States was, and in this modern photo we can see how Mobile has come along, and I'll give them credit, at least they're trying something with their modern buildings, although we can very clearly tell that they're modern buildings mixed in with the older and more artistic construction. I was also surprised to learn that Mobile apparently was the real origin of the Mardi Gras celebration, and I've wondered about the actual origins of the Mardi Gras celebration, and that's going to be in a subsequent exploration. But we're informed that the actual origin is in Mobile. So another way that it relates to New Orleans, which is where New Orleans is so famous for with the Mardi Gras celebration. Other interesting images from Mobile which give us a different perception. Indeed, it's something you'll find when you go into what we consider the Deep South in the United States. A very unique comparison of architecture, different styles, but also pay attention to the various building materials that are used, because you'll see quite a variance whether you're in Mobile, Pensacola, essentially any city or town in Georgia, Alabama, or Florida. It's quite intriguing. It's also interesting when you compare and contrast what we have for images and the capabilities of the cities. For example, here we have this convent Visitation that was constructed in 1855, and again we're seeing the incredible architectural capabilities of a fledgling nation and a fledgling state at the time, according to the official history. Let's take a closer look at this convent Visitation, and here we can see a bricked-in walk with some very advanced stairs, and oddly enough, many advanced buildings at that time with pediments and decorations above the door, and very advanced and impressive construction. We've seen many of these symbols before in our other explorations. We could also see, though, that Mobile boasts a somewhat similar appearance to New Orleans, and yet at the same time it seems to be unique. Now, of course, we could say it's because of the change in hands of who controlled the city during that time, according to the official history, and yet at the same time there are many questionable things, such as the Van Antwerp building that we're told was constructed in 1907 is one of the first high-rises or skyscrapers, if you want to consider it that, in Mobile. And it's very impressive, well-decorated building, and what exact style would it be? Well, don't bother trying to ask that. There was also yet another fire that occurred here. And it's always interesting that we have fires in all these cities, and how are these cities affected by these fires? And this looked like the Union Army rolled through and just left chimneys standing again, much like the same story that we have for Atlanta. Although there's no account of that happening, with Mobile not falling to the Union until the very end of the Civil War, according to the official history. You also find no shortage of these very elaborate houses across the South. Now, we've seen these in other locations, whether it's in the Midwest of the United States or anywhere else. But when you look at these early 1900s images of the skyline of Mobile, once again, you're given the impression that the city is a lot more built out and a lot more well-developed than our first impressions might indicate. And indeed, Mobile would find itself at the heart of shipbuilding efforts for the United States during World War II, where they churned out many great Liberty ships, or the cargo ships that the United States managed to build at an unprecedented rate. And yes, we're going to be having an exploration where we examine the entire achievements of the United States industrial machine during World War II, because it's quite an interesting question to consider. Back to Mobile, though, you'll find that there are no shortage of buildings that show the impressive architectural stylings that we've seen from times in the past, whether it's domes, it's good architecture and decorations on the front facades of these buildings, or even just the arches. And then you compare that with the newer buildings where they seem to have embraced the postmodern rail look or skeletal look on the buildings. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what they're going for. I mean, I'm going to be a little complimentary, though. They're trying something different with the artistic touch of the building, sort of like the 801 Grand building in Des Moines. But we have other buildings, such as this Baptist church in Mobile, that seems to have been very well constructed and even decided to have a couple columns beneath its small cupola on top. Interesting small structure, and it seems like it's a lot of effort, especially during that time frame. We also have other images, though, of the downtown of Mobile, which give us the inclination of how advanced the construction capabilities were. Indeed, we see mighty columns and many other towers and quite a well-developed electric infrastructure, if that's indeed what we're looking at. And yet, when we see other aspects of it within the modern time frame, or the Mardi Gras, it's exactly hard to say what's going on with this celebration, because these costumes just seem like it's something from a completely different world. Maybe that's just my perception. And it's just a crazy wild party that doesn't need to have any explanation, and that's perfectly fine. Yet you'll find that there are very interesting layouts for the properties in Mobile. The layout's very interesting, though, when we consider the fences and the balconies and all the hard work that went on those gates and the lattice work. We also see that there are other impressive churches which we'll be told are affiliated either with the French or the Spanish, and they tend to have some very elaborate Spanish name to them, and that's how we explain the very impressive Greek revival or neoclassical construction that we see in many of the structures. And there's no shortage of them in Mobile. And yet when you look at the older images, you have that same hint that the city seems to have gone through more than just a few fires and some conflicts. There seems to have been a great difficulty with things being dirty or worn down. Here in this Medical College of Alabama, though, again, we see a very advanced and impressive architectural capability. And just looking at this building, this appears to have been made out of some advanced concrete blocks or perhaps some sort of advanced geopolymer that we can't identify. Another one of these cotton exchanges, you might recall the very elaborate one that we saw in New Orleans, and Mobile has their own because you need to be reminded that you're definitely in the South, and that's how buildings are going to be purposed in the South, United States from the 1800s to the 1900s. You need to have your cotton exchange. It's also interesting to consider how railways factored into Mobile, and Mobile being a major seaport, it does make sense that we would expect the city to grow up, although the official history tells us that while the city did grow, it was not until World War II and afterwards that it really grew. So very interesting. We also see the more advanced buildings here, and of course we have a trolley because, again, you had trolleys right away in the 1890s and onward. Although when exactly they can move under their own locomotion with electric power is a subject of debate because there's conflicting accounts with it. Now we have the Mobile County Courthouse, the Mobile County Courthouse, and in the Mobile County Courthouse we see signs of advanced construction. Now, of course, we have a more modern courthouse or civic center there now, but this is quite impressive, especially given the decorations on the pediment over the four major columns. Again, looking at the fire, we can see that it was rather a devastating event, but how much was actually destroyed by it? And again, is this another one of these questionable events? And I'm also figuring out that the more I attempt to cover these events, the more difficulties I tend to have, so we'll lay off it for now. Here's Fort Morgan, one of the impressive star forts, and at the end of this exploration we're going to assess the effectiveness of two star forts actually in battle during the United States Civil War, because we have the Battle of Mobile Bay, which occurred here, and we can actually assess how effective the star forts were. We also see other examples of the impressive residences here, and I really appreciate the bell tower on top of this house. Now, again, why don't we build houses like this now? The answer will be given because we don't have the same quality of construction material, there's difficulty with the contractors, and we're simply not inclined. You can also find a wide variety of unique buildings looking in Mobile through the years, some of the buildings matching the constructions that we've seen in other cities that are rather unique. What's interesting to me is how it doesn't seem to have its own particular regional character. There seems to be everything, whether you're looking at a postcard or one of the legitimate images of Mobile. We see the unique columns and the impressive pillars and many of the great towers that reach to the very sky at a time frame when we thought it would be difficult. We also know that the city was quite the strategic location during the United States Civil War, and here you can see that wasn't just a postcard, it's an actual image and a photograph that again shows another trolley and impressive structures with great columns and wonderful building materials at a time when we expect the entire city to be constructed mostly out of wood. Now here's the Waterman Steamship headquarters, and this building was constructed in 1948. The only reason I show this is to compare and contrast to how it looks to the other buildings around it. There's also a very interesting mentality that comes with this building. This was to support the ship construction that had grown up in Mobile and really came to the full fruition during World War II. You also have this unique looking building, although the globe that's apparently been preserved all this time, and then a very odd interior with it as well. I don't know, there's just something a little off with that photograph, so I thought I would include it. Now we'll take a closer look at the courthouse, and we can see how the courthouse started at that time with its rather cut down cupola. Now I'm trying to ascertain if this is actually the same building as this courthouse that we're looking at, that features a much more elaborate top, or dome, or whatever you want to call it, and then other intricacies and supplementary towers with it. Or is it something else entirely? That's always the issue when you're just looking at images, because obviously I was not there in the 1890s, although I'm sure I'll have someone in the comments who will tell me that they know beyond any shadow of a doubt that they know exactly what transpired in the 1890s, and apparently there's a lot of 140 and 150-year-old people out there that I was never aware of. You all need to call Guinness. When you look closely at this building, you can see that there seems to be a conflicting account with it, and that's why I'm trying to determine if this was a different courthouse or if it was the same courthouse. Was this a building that was augmented and replaced? Or did they change the towers on it? Because we do have that account with the state capitol in North Dakota, where it seems as though they changed the actual top. There is even an account that the courthouse is subsequently replaced by an Art Deco building, but it's hard to find exact images. Well, here's what they have now for their courthouse, the Civic Center in Mobile, and yes, you can see this is what we'd expect for the modern building with its very impressive architecture that has a lot of great artistic detailing, and something that looks very painfully modern. And let's not forget all the wondrous glass. Ah, yes, the Mobile Government Plaza. It definitely looks like a plaza, and you've got to appreciate these entry doors. Okay, on to something more pleasant. Barton Academy, constructed in 1836. Now, we saw this laid out in the very early map that we looked at Mobile from the 1830s, an impressive cupola with 6 columns on the front of it, and then the columns on the cupola as well. And you can find many different images of Barton Academy, although what I find interesting is how concealed it is by the trees. How old are these trees around Barton Academy, and why does it seem like they don't want it to be so visible anymore? Now, apparently it continues as a fine institution of higher learning, and yet what was the original intention behind the building? Did they really build an elaborate university like this back in 1836? Or was there some other purpose behind it? Originally, could this building have had a different function? And indeed, looking at different perspectives of it, we can see that this is something we'd expect to be either a, dare I say, county courthouse, a state capitol. I mean, it certainly compares with some of the other ones that we've looked at. And yet in all the interior images I was able to see, I was expecting to see a very elaborate interior with this building, and I was quite disappointed, as though it seems it's been renovated and modernized, and there doesn't seem to be any interior images, at least that I saw, that really reflected the grand wonderment that this building once held. But if you happen to have older images or anything, please let me know in the comments. I did find this image, though, of students posing for this picture, and it does give you a good idea of the detailing behind the cupola on this particular building at Barton Academy. Very impressive, and all the way to the top, where it seems like they have modular construction with the columns. Now we have another Cathedral Basilica of the Immaculate Conception, built 1835 to 1850. Yes, another one of these. You can't go in exploration without seeing some sort of Cathedral Basilica of Immaculate Conception, or whatever particular name that we have. Now, this one may not seem so impressive on the outside until you look a little bit more closely at it, because if this really was built 1835 to 1850, consider that the concrete on this must be very old, well over 150 years old, and yet it seems to be holding up very well, right down to having advanced portal windows, and we have another one of these very fine stained glass colored windows, or whatever the actual method was used to color it. I mean, I use that term in jest because I don't believe we know the actual technique that was used to compile and construct these windows. And we have older images that show us just how elaborate the interior of this particular cathedral basilica are. Although I'll save the money shot for the very end of this particular structure, because even in the black and white photos it gives you an idea of just how ornate and detailed it really is. Tremendously impressive for the efforts of 1835 to 1850. And keep in mind, this was at the same time frame that we're told that just in neighboring Georgia, Atlanta was being built out of the dust when it was a major terminus point for the railroads. And yet down in Mobile, they were doing all this. Shortly after our boy James Wilkinson, or Wilkie as we call him, managed to capture the city from the Spanish, who he was acting as an agent for. So I guess the Spanish did a good job of ensuring that they protected the identity of their agent by having him capture their city. They'll never suspect him, and according to the official historical accounts, the United States was well aware that James Wilkinson was a spy, but did nothing about it. What a surprise. And we also have another one of these organs, an impressive construction on the inside, with this cathedral, basilica. And here, I just wanted to show this as we actually see the foundation. Now, supposedly, this is supporting one of the major columns, or several of the major columns in the building in the foundation. Interesting arrangement of the bricks, of the blocks, or whatever it's actually made out of, and oftentimes we don't see images like this. And yet just above it you can see these impressive columns and how much weight is really being put or supported by the foundation itself. And is it really deep in the ground, or how exactly did they do it? And how are we able to do it in 1835 to 1850? Lots of effort, no safety standards, 24-hour days for 15 years, and I'm sure that's exactly what we'll be told. You see, no shortage of these impressive iron gates or steel gates or whatever they're exactly made from, fences, and very elaborate entryways all across the South. And it's something that is a little unique in the South that I will say, although you see it if you look hard enough in other regions of the United States and across the land. And of course we have our usual portico indentations above the columns because apparently that was rather easy to pull off from 1835 to 1850 as well. Now let's look at the interior, and here you can see just how elaborate and beautiful this cathedral basilica truly is to this day. Very impressive that this is coming up on very close to being a 200-year-old structure. And yet it looks this gorgeous on the inside. Indeed, so gorgeous that they presented a picture of it to Pope John Paul II in 2004, towards the end of his tenure as Pope. Very impressive across the board, and we have to wonder why the structure would warrant the attention that it does from the Pope himself. Not sure exactly what to make of it. Now let's take a look at Fort Condé, or Fort Charlotte it was known when the British controlled it. It was supposedly constructed in 1723 by that French genius who laid out the city of Mobile back in the day. And this is the renovated version of it, but it's still a very impressive structure, even with the renovations on it that we can tell are quite modern. Hard to know what to make of the interior and how much has been modified or renovated and what was the real purpose of this particular star fort, because we oftentimes see these elaborate plug holes or other devices and unique pieces of equipment that we can't fully identify. Of course, the interior, we can see that it's been turned into a total tourist attraction. And of course, we have our usual displays of information, and I really appreciate the fact that we have the picture of the French individual, the visionary, and of course being painted in his armor that probably only weighed half a pound. Yet, oddly enough, we can get an idea of some of the advanced vault layout within this former star fort, or current star fort, however you want to classify it. But what's the actual quality of the materials on the bricks and the floor? That's something I would very much like to assess and determine. Now, let's look at Fort Morgan, constructed 1819 and 1834 by the United States military as part of defending Mobile Bay. And here we can see the classic star fort construction. And a very elaborate structure fortification, although how effective were these star forts as fortifications? Strangely enough, we have the account from the War of 1812, which we would assume the United States military was drawing from lessons learned, that they needed to make sure that they properly defended coastal targets, as we're well aware of the fact that Washington, D.C. was invaded by the British and burned. Another unfortunate performance for the United States military. So we'd like to think that they learned their lessons, and so what they were doing was building these elaborate star forts. And if we go off the official military history, although oddly enough we're told that these particular star forts, Morgan was completely ineffective in the United States Civil War. And here's the original plan that we supposedly have from it that was composed in 1817. If you want to go along with that, with a date, very elaborate design, and once again, it's a single perspective plan. I love single perspective plans. You just can't get enough of them. It's amazing what they could do. And here we have some images from it shortly after its capture by Union forces, as this was a Confederate stronghold during the United States Civil War. And we have some very odd and puzzling images. And lacking color at the same time, of course, because color photography hadn't been invented. And we think that maybe this fort was part of a significant battle. We're told that it was in the Battle of Mobile Bay, where Admiral Farragut managed to run the Union Navy past the defenses and defeat a smaller Confederate naval force and overcome the defenses of these impressive star forts. So not to spoil the story for you, but this is exactly where we find that the Star Fort was not remotely effective as defensive fortifications during the United States Civil War. We're told that the whole reason Star Forts came about was because of cannons, but apparently the cannons in the United States Civil War advanced faster than the Star Forts could, and the Battle of Mobile Bay is a very interesting example we're going to do a subsequent exploration looking at in preparation for our live stream, and indeed I'll include it as bonus content at the end of the video. Because let me assure you, Mobile Bay is very strange. Wait a minute. What's going on here? Looks like this individual is taking a nap or just a random sleep during the middle of the day. Was this an exhausted Confederate soldier? I mean, I thought nobody slept in the 1800s. They were working 24-hour days. Or 24-hour days, 7-day weeks, and hey, over here, what's this other individual doing? Looks like he's posing, putting his hands on his hips. Really odd. Then we have another picture of the fort with Old Glory flying over it, the United States Stars and Stripes, and once again we have one solitary Union sentry who is guarding it. Well, you know, I guess that's all you needed, one single soldier to secure it. It didn't work for the Confederates to defend the harbor. with, but you only need one soldier to actually guard it. Or maybe he was posing for the picture, I don't know. When you look in the interior, though, of Fort Morgan, you can see the advanced construction techniques with numerous arches and all sorts of different blocks. Now, you might just think that this entire fort's made of brick, but when you look at this entryway, you get the impression that it's made of something else, a more advanced concrete or a geopolymer which seems to have stood up rather well since the finality of its construction in the early 1800s. So what exactly is going on here? Why do we always have these conflicting accounts and even these conflicting images? And this is why I strongly encourage you that if you're in Alabama or vicinity of Mobile Bay, that you actually go and visit the Star Fort, because it's one of the best locations to do your own personal analysis on the actual construction materials that were used with it. And indeed, we have our little plate here, or inscription telling us when the fort was completed, Morgan, 1833. But it'll be obsolete by the time of the United States Civil War, and that's why the Confederates lost the Battle of Mobile Bay, although they put up a great fight. They didn't know they were up against Admiral Farragut. Yes, it's quite an interesting story. But you also see what I mean with what's going on with these little storage areas, of course, because we'll be told that these are placements for the cannons, the mighty cannons that could do everything, but then they were really needed, they did nothing, and everything's all over on the competence spectrum. But I always find some of these vault rooms quite interesting because it looks as though we have some other sort of phenomenon going on here with the brick, but it does appear as though there's some sort of deterioration that's occurred. And maybe you'll just say because it's so unbelievably old, although the entryway didn't seem to be doing too poorly, what exactly happened here? Again, this is just natural erosion. Is there some lichen or moss that's growing on the bricks and it's causing the bricks to break down, or something else happened? And that's why I encourage you to visit the site in person, and we'll look at Fort Gaines, constructed in 1821, the other Star Fort, or Star Formation, defending Mobile Bay. And quite an interesting layout for this one as well, and another interesting story. And it seems as though the United States had no challenge rapidly constructing all these Star Fort fortifications with wonderful construction materials which still hold up to this day after the War of 1812. So I suppose we're supposed to consider the fact that this was the answer to the threat that the nations, such as the British, who at the time possessed the most powerful navy in the world, could pose to the United States. Ah, yes, Fort Gaines was famous for the capturing of Aaron Burr in February 1807. For those of you not familiar, Aaron Burr was apparently a politician that was engaged in acts of sedition against the United States, and for some unknown reason, a single individual was considered a great threat to the nation at that time. Or it's just some story that you're supposed to remember and recall that there were great threats to democracy. Even though they had generals who couldn't win battles in the War of 1812 when they outnumbered the enemy by a ratio of 5-1 in multiple occasions, but that's okay. That's no reason to court-martial them. We always see these cannons, and we're told that during the Battle of Mobile Bay, the Confederates struggled because their cannons couldn't traverse for some reason. And consider the fact that the Battle of Mobile Bay occurred in 1864, several years in the Civil War. So what did they do? They just didn't concern themselves with defending a very strategic site, which is rather hard to believe because we have conflicting accounts about the Confederate military, which was considered very competent indeed. They inflicted many defeats on superior Union forces in many battles, and of course there's a number of reasons given to that. Well, it wasn't the quality of soldiers, it was the quality of generals, it was the fact that we're fighting the battles in the South. Many different reasons, and it's another reason why the Civil War is such an interesting conflict to study. What you can see is that a lot of effort was put into erecting these fortifications. And yet at the same time, we're told that they were already obsolete by the United States Civil War. And there was apparently no effort to improve them prior to the United States Civil War, because something the United States military does is it rests on its laurels between the conflicts in the early 1800s. But in any event, there's a lot of other mysteries that we're going to look at in Mobile and subsequent explorations on the ground. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. So let's take a little look at the Battle of Mobile Bay. Now, this occurred in August of 1864, and just to put things in context, this was during the Union's Georgia campaign and the looming presidential election of November 1864, when it was feared that the Democratic challenger to Republican President Abraham Lincoln, by the name of George B. McClellan, you might remember him, he was the ineffective Union general earlier in the United States Civil War and also a hero of Ken Burns, was going to defeat Lincoln. The interesting thing about this account of the Battle of Mobile Bay is that this appears to be someone's diary page, and this is from our good friends at the United States Library of Congress, so we certainly can't question the authenticity of it. But oddly enough, that the account of the Battle of Mobile Bay is not something that, well, dare I say, looks a little bit more precise, scientific, well drawn. You would think that Admiral Farragut, who was the Union commander of the fleet that attacked Mobile Bay, would have a staff officer. Oh, wait, they didn't have staff back then. But he would have a subordinate who would actually compose their plan and then write what's called an after action review to show what really happened. Now, this does depict how the battle supposedly went down, and what we have is Admiral Farragut with Union Army Commander Gordon Granger, who was rather famous for the Battle of Chickamauga and the subsequent Battle of Chattanooga, and then immortalized as the one delivering the message that prompted the holiday of Juneteenth, which we have in the United States now. Admiral Farragut arrayed his 19 ships, and then they had to run past the impregnable and impossible to breach defenses of Fort Morgan and Fort Gaines, which we looked at in the exploration. And not only that, but the Confederate Torpedo Bureau, yes, they had a torpedo bureau, what we would call mines today, had been laid across the waterway. And the whole intention behind them was to force the Union ships to go close to the forts, where the forts would destroy them with their cannons. What we're told is that Admiral Farragut had a good idea of the layout of the obstacles, and he also was aware of piloting within the channel so the ships wouldn't run aground. And this is the exact course that they took, going right by Fort Morgan, and Fort Morgan's guns were ineffective. As they moved, they were attacked by the CSS Tennessee, and it was commanded by Admiral Franklin Buchanan, who was the overall Confederate naval commander. Now, Franklin Buchanan was famous for commanding the CSS Virginia in the famous Battle of Hampton Roads, which was a tactical draw, but a strategic Union victory because the blockade was preserved. Well, as the Union forces ran past the guns of Fort Morgan, they used their ironclads to protect their vulnerable wooden ships, or so we're told. And oddly enough, Admiral Farragut was riding in the USS Hartford at the time when the USS Tecumseh, one of the ironclads, struck a mine and rolled over and sank rather quickly. We also have this very dramatic story of the captain pictured here telling his pilot to abandon ship first, and someone did a sketch of that too. Well, when that happened, the fleet sort of hesitated, and Admiral Farragut said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Now, of course, there's many different interpretations of what he actually said and how it was communicated, but bottom line up front, they did a rapid advance and moved into the channel while they were still at the time fighting the Rams and the CSS Tennessee. Now, it should be noted that the Confederate force was 4 ships and the Union force was 19 ships. Well, 18 after they lost the Tecumseh. And then in fighting within Mobile Bay, they finally managed to compel the CSS Tennessee to surrender when they managed to knock a single hole in its iron armor. So I guess that was enough for Franklin Buchanan to say, forget it. And then, oddly enough, the Star Forts then subsequently capitulated when Union Commander Gordon Granger landed his forces near Fort Morgan, and then the commander, Confederate General R.L. Page, pictured here, decided that he was simply going to surrender, which was odd because, again, we thought that star forts are just impossible to attack, but then we're also told that they were obsolete at this time. So a very interesting account of this battle, and we're told that this battle was not considered a great victory at the time. It became more pertinent as the election drew near, and then Sherman conducted his march to the sea in Georgia. And then suddenly everybody said, Mobile Bay, it was the great victory for the Union. Interesting note about Admiral Farragut, the Union commander. He was the first naval officer to hold the rank of full admiral. Another intricacy about the United States military is that they didn't use their highest ranks well into their existence, indeed, at the end and after the United States Civil War, which is unique. And then furthermore, the fact that Admiral Farragut actually started out as a midshipman when he was 9 to 11 years old. Yes, much like his was depicted in the movie Master and Commander in the Far Side of the World. So what exactly do you make of that? And what do you think of this interesting sketch of the Battle of Mobile Bay from someone's diary with the guided rule lines? I don't know. It almost looks as though this could have been doodled by a cadet at Annapolis as he was sleeping through history class. And believe me, I ought to know that those history classes can be very boring no matter what interesting topic you're talking about. I used to be the one spewing them. Well, thank you for joining me.